my birthday this past week. I turned 63 and thought it important to have a little preventative maintenance done on my chassis. So Monday, had my teeth cleaned. Tuesday, had 6 precancerous lesions frozen off. Fasted on Wednesday in preparation for a colonoscopy on Thursday, which did not begin well when I received word that the procedure would be done by a visiting gastroenterologist from Minnesota. A visiting doctor from 3 states away, a gastroenterologist. Visiting doctor. Apparently this is a thing now done to lessen the chances of having your colonoscopy done by someone you might later see at the grocery store. So they just all do this, come in from all over so that you don't meet these people ever again. But this doctor walked into my room there, my little cubicle where I was laying on the gurney, and he was reading my chart from my last colonoscopy 5 years ago, and he had a frown on his face. And he said, it looks like they found some very scary polyps the last time you were here, which was news to me. I would have remembered that and worked it into conversations. A missed opportunity for a hypochondriac. As you can imagine, news of my almost cancer was somewhat alarming, so alarming I forgot to tell my classic colonoscopy joke about finding my father's boot from 1977. Fortunately, the doctor said everything was fine, that my colon was perfect. I have never in all my life been so proud of an internal organ. So that was my week. How was yours? I hope well. On a lighter note, a higher note, you'll remember that last week we discussed osmosis, about the gradual assimilation of the highest ideals we can imagine, and how Quakerism for me has always been a community in which one soaks up and absorbs the virtues we treasure, like compassion and mercy and generosity and thoughtfulness and kindness. I just love those words and the feelings they conjure up. I promised last week that we'd be thinking about the key features of Quakerism, the qualities that make us Quakers. We are now entering the treacherous landscape of theology, where one misstep can prove disastrous. So it behooves us to heed the protocol, to ask the questions in the right order. Because if we don't, you are all familiar with the notion that if you have 2 lines that begin very closely, where one line begins to deviate, you grow further and further apart. And this is how bad theology always starts and gets worse. You don't ask the important questions right up front and deal with it right where you should. And after a while, you end up with horrible, horrible theology like Christian nationalism. So this is how this all begins. So anytime we have a theological process, we have to make sure we're beginning in the right place. And I suggest to you that the right question to start with is this: how are God's preferences known? How do we know and discern God's will? If that isn't our first question, it should definitely be our second. The Baptists down the road would say, well, that's easy. God's will is revealed in the Bible. The Catholics would remind us that before the Bible reached its formation, we had church tradition and hierarchy, so we need to follow that. Joel Osteen would say, we know something is God's will if it makes us rich and happy. The reason we begin with the question of knowing God's will is because the discernment of God's will and human power are always closely related. One follows the other. Whoever has the authority to tell us God's will, you'll notice, is the person who ends up with all the cards. Or in the case of Joel Osteen, a 17,000 square foot mansion, like a man with 6 motorcycles has room to talk. But think about it. Whenever someone claims to be the authoritative source of divine will, it always ends up as a grab for power, as a grab for control, as a grab for wealth. The abuse of that power gave birth to Quakerism, which was an energetic, that's the only word for it, an energetic reaction and rejection of ecclesiastical and hierarchical authority in order to embrace what I will call the democratic discernment of God's will. The democratic discernment of God's will. We Quakers believe God's will is not known through a book or a person or a hierarchy, but is instead known through democratic discernment, a process of careful listening involving all the community, a process in which everyone participates, in which all perspectives are heard, weighed, and considered. Who holds the power in democratic discernment? Where does it rest? Not with one person or a hierarchy or even a book. It rests with the community, with the meeting. When I was pastoring up in the city, a woman, just a tremendous woman, we became dear friends. She began attending our meeting. She had become a Christian as an adult, attending an evangelical church led by a charismatic minister who had to leave that church for vision problems. He mistook his secretary for his wife. And so that didn't work out. He left there, and she was kind of traumatized by that, so began looking for another church to go. And she started coming to our Quaker meeting because she lived right down the street from us. And her second week there, she wanted to start a children's program. And she came to see me wanting my permission to start it. I said to her, that's not my call. In a Quaker meeting, decisions are made by the body, by the congregation, not by the pastor. She said, but in my old church, the pastor was in charge. Why aren't you in charge? And no one has ever asked me that before because people have generally known me well enough to know why I'm not in charge. But I explained to her that Quakers believe God's will was known through the gathered community. I didn't use the term democratic discernment, but that's what I meant. I said, so talk to the meeting about it. And so she talked to the meeting about it, and as she talked to the meeting about it, it became more than just her passion and concern. It became the concern of the entire meeting. And as everyone gathered and shared and talked about the needs in our community, a wonderful ministry to children rose out of that involved tutoring, that involved feeding children who would otherwise have gone hungry at night, that involved in this congregation of elderly Quakers providing grandparents to all of the children in our neighborhood who didn't have any. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful because it came out of democratic discernment. We don't concentrate the power of the meeting in the hands of one person or one committee or one position. We invite one another into a relationship, and in the context of that relationship, we discern together our way forward, our calling, our mission. When I was a kid, my dad was a thus saith the Lord kind of father. And you know the kind I mean. He told us what to do and we did it, whether we liked it or not. Part of that was a safeguard against chaos. When you have 5 children in 6 years, you have to have order. But I'll never forget one evening him calling us into the front parlor of our house and asking us to sit down. He told us he'd been offered a significant job in Ohio that would require our moving over there. He said, "This involves all of us, so we'll make the decision together. I want to know what you think." We stared at one another, wondering who had kidnapped our father and who was this man who looked just like him. But after the shock wore off, we discussed it, going around the circle, each of us talking. None of us wanted to move. We had our friends. We lived in a town we all loved. It was obvious to us that our dad wanted that job. He kept mentioning how nice it would be to have more money, how we could do more things, how he could pay for our college. So I kept waiting for him to say, "Well, I don't care what you think, we're moving anyway, pack your bags." But he didn't say that. He sat there like a Quaker clerk and said, "I have the sense you want to stay here." And though it wasn't a Quaker meeting, when I look back on it now, it might have been my first experience with democratic discernment. I remember sitting there with my family, feeling included and important and empowered, a part of something larger than myself. Friends, you and I live in a culture that has vested great power, some would say overwhelming power, in the hands of a few corporations, politicians, oligarchs, and technology titans. Ours is a gilded age where the few rule the many. There isn't a day that passes that I don't feel powerless. And I'm an old white guy. I can't imagine what it feels like to be a woman or a person of color in this culture. In times like these, it is imperative for friends to model a way of living together that cares for and includes everyone, that includes all people and not just a privileged few. We can't wait for democratic discernment to trickle down, settling for crumbs of power the highest and mightiest toss our way. It is time we not only model the soaring possibilities of cooperative community, it is time we insist on it and work on it for all people, leaving no one behind, No one stranded, broken, and bleeding on the roadside. In this sense, democratic discernment is the highest aim of Jesus, whom you'll remember God anointed to proclaim good news to the poor, whom God sent to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, whom God commissioned to set the oppressed free. When God sets a table, this is Theology 101, our first assertion, that when God sets a table, there is a seat for everyone. No one chair is higher than any other, no portion larger or more magnificent. We dine at the table as equals. Just as there is no low seat, so too is there no seat of honor. Equal stature, equal voices, equal power, equal people, everyone together partaking.